Good morning, afternoon, or evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Senior Airman Laughlin. I'm here on behalf of the 96th Comptroller Squadron, and today I'm going to walk you through the finance portion of our briefing. So you'll notice on the first slide that we have here, we have our contact information. I'm not going to over-embellish on that at the moment. I'd like to give you the full body of information for you to understand and process first, and then on the very last slide, I'll give you our contact information once more. All right, so when are entitlements authorized? When can I expect entitlements? What sort of entitlements can I expect? That being said, there's a lot of questions that remain, so I'd like to walk you through each portion as best as I'm able to do. So if you want to think of the DoD spectrum as consisting of two pieces, you're going to have the civilian portion and you're going to have the military portion as well. So when it comes to the civilian portion, if in the case that a mandatory evacuation is ordered and you have to leave the area, the fact that you may or may not receive entitlements is always pending. So if you're a civilian employee, you're going to want to stay in touch with your chain of command. As the situation unfurls, you're going to receive a little more guidance as time goes on, and you very well may be compensated to some sort of reimbursement for any sort of mandatory evacuation that occurs. Now, if you go to military, it's going to be a little more uniform. So whenever it is that you have an evacuation on hand, you need to know that there's three different types. So you have the voluntary evacuation, the recommended evacuation, and then lastly would be the mandatory evacuation. So for voluntary evacuations, you end up leaving the area on your own tuition, essentially, and there's going to be no sort of reimbursement for that. If you have a recommended evacuation, basically base leadership will say, hey, it might get a little rough in this area. We recommend that you leave the area. It's not mandatory, so there is no entitlement or reimbursement for that type of evacuation. Now, if you have a mandatory evacuation, that's a verbal order that says, hey, you can't stay here. You have to go somewhere else and shelter in place for the time being. So if that is the case, then you very well may be entitled to reimbursement. So the only type of evacuation that you would be entitled to reimbursement is going to be a mandatory evacuation. Now, regarding entitlements, there's still a lot of questions that remain about what sort of entitlements can you expect and when can you expect them. So that being said, again, when you're under a mandatory evacuation, that would be the only time that you can receive entitlements or reimbursements. So under an evacuation, you may receive these reimbursements. Now, as a note, policies can certainly change as time goes on. These situations are dynamic, and as time progresses, the initial policies they set in place, they may evolve. So it's important to know that there's a certain bit of leeway with everything that I say here now, but I'm going to go over everything that's set in stone currently, and then if in the case that I need to elaborate on anything, I'll do so as we go along. So currently, a member, a military member, wherever it is that you end up putting down roots after this evacuation that's mandatory, you would receive 100% of the per diem at the TDY rate for that location. And if in the case that you are dependent of that member over the age of 12, you would also receive 100% of the per diem rate for a TDY. If in the case that you're dependent under the age of 12, then you would end up receiving just 50% of that TDY rate. So every single member and dependent that is qualified can receive reimbursement at those rates for each and every day. Now, before I explain those rates, I'm just going to take a slight tangent into mileage. So if in the case that you do evacuate to a certain location, you're probably going to have to drive to that location. So you would be paid mileage at the TDY rate, which for 2020 is going to be 54 cents per mile, and you'll be paid from the base that you leave all the way to wherever your safe haven may be, so wherever you put down roots in that temporary time period. And then they would pay you the mileage to return back to wherever your duty station was initially. So that being said, if you have dependents and you take 2 POVs, you can pay up to 2 POVs worth of mileage. But if you take more than 3 POVs, or if you take more than 2, I should say, you're not going to be paid more than 2 vehicles. And if you're just a single member, it would just be 1 POV's worth of mileage. Now, going back to the per diem rate, there's going to be 2 big types of per diem that you're going to want to be concerned with. So you have the local per diem rate, and then you have the standard CONUS rate. So scenario, say for example, a mandatory evacuation is ordered. You end up having to leave your duty station to go to a safe location, and they establish a radius of 500 miles that you can be within for this evacuation. So if you're anywhere within that 500 miles they established, you would be entitled to the local per diem rate at the TDY rate. So that would depend on whatever locality you end up putting down routes in. So if you're in a metropolitan area, you're probably going to get a little bit more compensation. And if you're in a more rural area, it'll probably be a little bit less, but it should be adequate to whatever quality of life you are subject to in that area. Now, say for example, no area within that 500-mile limit suits you. If you go beyond that limit, then you would only be entitled to the standard CONUS rate for per diem. Now, that's going to be a flat rate that's uniform in any area outside of that radius. So it doesn't matter if you're in a metropolitan area or a rural area, you'll just receive that standard rate. If you do want to find these per diem rates, a great resource is going to be www.defensetravel.dod.mil, and then you can look at the per diem calculator they have there. It'll display everything for either the locality or the standard rate that may be applicable to you. And then it'll give you a good idea of what you are spending and what you should be spending. So that way you can basically live within your means. You don't have to worry about overspending on any one area. And then if you are entitled to reimbursement, then we can reimburse you accordingly. Now, when it comes to reimbursements, you're definitely going to want to provide documentation, but you won't need any sort of documentation pertaining to food or gas because, again, those are going to be paid to you at those flat rates for the per diem and the mileage respectively. When it comes to other factors, though, big expenses you're definitely going to want to chronicle would be lodging receipts, airfare receipts if you end up taking a flight anywhere, and then also probably another important one that you would want to look into is if you end up taking a cash withdrawal from an ATM, if you're concerned about EFT availability, you're going to want to keep those receipts as well. So in the grand scheme of things, the final goal is to file a final comprehensive travel voucher for the evacuation period, and it's going to encompass every destination that you went to from departure to return. So that being said, within that voucher, we're going to encompass all of the expenses that you had been subject to in the meantime. And that way, we'll be able to pay you for any sort of travel that had been incurred, any sort of expenses that had been incurred. And again, that is if you are entitled to any sort of reimbursement from this process. So whenever you end up filing that final voucher at the very end of the process, that's when you're going to want to include these receipts. Now, what is the requirement for a valid receipt? It's going to have to adhere to 4 main guidelines. So you're going to want to have your name on it, the period of time, the payment method, for example, maybe you paid for it with Visa, and then lastly, you're going to have the proof of payment on there. So we lovingly refer that to as the zero balance within the office. So if you incur a set price, it's going to list that. The remaining balance should say 0 at the bottom of the receipt. That way they know that you ended up paying for the receipt. You didn't cancel any reservations or things of that nature, and then you can be reimbursed at an applicable rate. All right, so if in the case you are a foreign officer, which we have many foreign officers that train amongst us, you may also be entitled to some sort of reimbursement if a mandatory evacuation order is set in place. Now, it would be limited to lodging and transportation costs because per diem is not payable to foreign officers. But something to note is that if in the case you were to receive a reimbursement, it would be via check and it would be through the Joint Programs Office or JPO. So if in the case that a time of crisis arises, you're a foreign officer, you're going to want to have some good ties to the JPO office. You can give them a call and they're going to have a little bit more information in regards to when you can expect a reimbursement and what you can expect a reimbursement for. Definitely hold on to any sort of pertinent documentation regarding airfare or lodging, as you may need to provide that in order to receive your reimbursement. Now, again, I had mentioned earlier that in the full spectrum of things, you're going to want to concern yourself with the final voucher that we'll file for the evacuation period. So when it comes to vouchers, you're probably thinking, hey, how do I get a hold of these orders? When do I file this voucher? Who do I go to file this voucher with? That's something that I'm going to go over in this portion. Now, again, just to reiterate, you're going to want to keep track of all big receipts that you have, so lodging, airfare, maybe cash withdrawal receipts if that's applicable to you. And note that the orders are going to be created for you upon your return. So in the time of mandatory evacuation, it's likely going to be a verbal order that is distributed because oftentimes you don't have the luxury of time to print up some hard copy orders to hand to people as they go out the door. So that being said, you will receive orders when you come back and get settled, but you're not going to file these orders or receive them through DTS. You're also not going to file your final travel through DTS. So no need to concern yourself with DTS. If anyone directs you toward that, you can definitely reach out to us for questions, because we're going to have a good frame of knowledge for when you can receive the orders. But you will file your evacuation voucher. Again, it'll be comprehensive, every portion of your travel, as well as every expense that you incurred, with the local financing office that services you. It'll be a hard copy voucher. We'll review it in the office, and then we'll end up elevating it to the proper agency for a review and a payout if deemed applicable to do so. Now, another pretty valid question you might receive is, hey, I might be deployed. What can my dependents do if they're in an area that is ordered to evacuate on a mandatory evacuation? So if in the case that we are directed and able to do so, we can distribute cash advances to your dependents if they're in an affected area. So as an example of this, last year in 2019, Hurricane Michael touched down on the coastline and the Tyndall area had to evacuate. So some members had been deployed, and the dependents came over to the Eglin area where we work, and they needed some cash advances to get their expenses settled out. So we were directed and able to provide them to them. So we got them all set up with that. The money was distributed in a timely manner, and it helped them to adjust to their new current reality. So if you want to know more about that during time of crisis, definitely stay in touch with the SHIRT or the equivalent, because they're going to be very well informed and they should get that information quite quickly. One final thing I would like to touch upon is that if you are a dependent, you need to be listed on the AFPAS roster in order to be valid for any sort of reimbursement that you may be entitled to. So that being said, definitely make sure that you're on that roster, or if you're a member, make sure your dependents are on that roster. If you don't know how to go about doing so, I would reach out to your chain of command first, but you can always refer to us because we have a good frame of knowledge for how to accomplish that. If your dependent is not on the AFPAS roster, then they're not entitled to any sort of reimbursement whatsoever. So definitely keep that in mind and make sure that you're able to update that as soon as possible. Now, the government travel card, which is what GTC stands for, some people don't know that. There's no shame in that. It is not mandatory for use in this situation, so don't feel pressured to use it, but it is a resource for you to utilize if in the case that you feel as though you need it. So if you don't have a government travel card, you're definitely going to want to reach out to your unit's GTC representative as soon as you can. It's good to have this on hand as a resource because you don't want to not have it and need it. So definitely reach out to them for some assistance. They should be able to set you up with a card in a timely manner. Now, if in the case you do use your GTC, just know that there's some stipulations attached. So you're not going to want to use it for personal items or at unauthorized merchants. Definitely keep it down to the bare necessities when using the GTC. So you can use your GTC for lodging, meals, gas if you take a POV, and you can also use it for a cash withdrawal too if you feel as though that EFT might not be available in the area you're going to. So don't hesitate to use it for those facets of your expenses as long as you need to do so. But don't feel pressured to use the GTC if you don't have to. You can certainly use your own funds. And if you are entitled to a reimbursement, then you would just receive that reimbursement. It could be to your personal account. Excellent. And then that wraps up our presentation for today. So just to reiterate, these times of crisis pop up from time to time in life, and it's important for us to be dynamic during that time. But just know that the policies set in place can be dynamic as well. So the initial set of policies or guidelines that they present to you, they very well may evolve as time goes on. But that being said, if you ever have any questions or concerns, you're more than welcome to reach out to us. The two phone numbers that we have on file, the travel section and military pay section, respectively are 882-5441 and 882-1114. The travel section is going to be a great resource for anything travel related, so dealing with evacuation entitlements, mileage, things of that nature. And then the military pay section is more geared towards anything that you would typically see on a regular LES, so your payment, your entitlements, things of that concern. Our phone lines are always open during regular weekdays between the hours of 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. And if in the case that those hours don't suit you, we do currently have an organization email inbox, and it's going to be directed to 96cpts.financialcustomerservices@us.af.mil. As always, thank you from the 96 Comptroller Squadron, and if in the case you ever need a hand, never hesitate to reach out to us because we would love to give that to you. Thank you.